She keeps a Moet Chandon in a pretty cabinet. Let them eat cake, she says, just like Marie Antoinette. Building a remedy for Khrushchev and Kennedy. At any time, an invitation you can't decline.
Queen, perhaps the most unique band in the history of rock music. A group of 4 talented musicians who, in combination, produced some of the most daring, accomplished and diverse works of the last 50 years.
I don't think there's ever been a vocalist, certainly in rock music, with the ability that Freddie Mercury had to cross so many different streams, so many different barriers, boundaries and genres. The man could do so many different things.
From their inception in the 1970s, the band evolved from a traditional rock act into an unclassifiable oddity, an anomaly in a decade of critical categorization and pigeonholing.
Being diverse, doing so many different things, you are taking a risk. It's much more risky. You do stand the risk of alienating sections of your audience. But most Queen fans are so loyal and dedicated, I think they took on board everything that they ever did.
Because she couldn't care less, fastidious and precise. She's a killer queen, gunpowder gelatine, dynamite with a laser beam, guaranteed to blow your mind.
With their meteoric rise, the band amassed a huge following and emerged as both one of the most impressive live acts and one of the biggest-selling rock bands in the world.
They're one of the most successful, most popular live acts of all time, because they could come out and they could play for an hour and a half and it would just be hits.
This programme is an examination of the band's career in the 1970s, their revolutionary records, their musical significance, and the unique talents of the band themselves. Queen began life in 1970 when Brian May and Roger Taylor, 2 members of Smile, a popular student 3-piece from Imperial College London, decided to form a new band. Freddie Mercury, an enthusiastic Smile fan and mutual friend, joined May and Taylor as a vocalist and proposed that they should call themselves Queen. The band went through 3 different bass players before being introduced to John Deacon, who completed the Queen lineup in 1971. After recording their first demo in late 1971, Queen caught the attention of Barry and Norman Sheffield of Trident Productions. Brian and Roger were wary of any potential recording contract after some disappointments during their time with Smile, but Trident offered what appeared to be a good deal. 3 separate agreements covering publishing, recording and management, as well as wages and equipment for the band. Queen signed the contracts in late 1972, though the nature of the agreement raised eyebrows in the music press.
It has to be remembered, in the early 70s, people still thought of rock music as the people's music. It was going to emerge from the back room of a pub somewhere, 4 guys getting together to play the blues maybe, and struggling for several years with no money, and one day perhaps producing a hit record. This was the kind of the slow process of, that people thought was the democratic right way to produce rock records. And Queen turned that on its head really by coming out very quickly with a whole package. You know, they had all the ends sewn up. They weren't going to mess around playing in pubs for years, that's for sure, hoping to be spotted by a journalist from Melody Maker or the NME. The way they did it was to produce an album, their first album, with a top producer, get a contract, a powerful management behind them, and the backing of Trident Studios behind them. So it looked to the outsider as if in some way they were a manufactured group. In fact, Melody Maker ran a piece at the time. Unfortunately for Queen, really, this new idea of manufacturing bands, which of course nowadays everybody accepts is the way pop music is created, you know, with Pop Idol. So all pop stars now are considered to be manufactured in some respect. They are sold, marketed and merchandised. All magazines are, all television programs are. So that's not news, really. But back in the early 70s, it was a bit shocking. They were breaking the rules by appearing to be so well organised.
In summer 1973, EMI released Queen's first single, Keep Yourself Alive. The single flopped, being rejected by Radio 1 5 times and failing to raise much interest.
I remember when Keep Yourself Alive came out, and I thought, fine. You have to remember, in 1973, Britain was still the leader of rock music in the world. The individual ex-Beatles were still recording and having massive international hits. Elton John was the top pop star in the world. Eric Clapton had a comeback. Rod Stewart was a new and amazing vocalist. David Bowie was new, and Pink Floyd put out Dark Side of the Moon. So it was all happening here. And in that context, you can see that Queen didn't initially make that big a splash. Having an all-right record, which would now be grounds for celebration, wasn't good enough then.
It's always difficult to talk about the first single of a band because so few bands hit with the single immediately that defines their career. And with Queen, there is no one track which defines their career. In fact, sometimes the songs defy their career. But Keep Yourself Alive was an interesting start. It was a very good, hard, rocking, driving, anthemic type of song. And the individual flamboyance of Freddie Mercury's vocals came through immediately. The sad thing was, of course, it wasn't a hit. In fact, it was a complete and utter flop.
Keep yourself alive.
Keep Yourself Alive, the whole riff is based around pentatonic boxes, so that's blues. And pentatonic boxes it just refers to a way of playing up the neck, which we'll show you in a second. So the riff to Keep Yourself Alive is an interesting use of, as we were saying, the serrated edge of the pick. I'm not sure what sound it would be, so we'll use the proper rhythm sound. And it starts in E, and then it goes up to there, which is A flat, which is, I don't know about the saddest of all keys, it's certainly one of the most difficult. So the main riff is dig-a-dig-a-dig, and his rhythm is great, but when the main riff comes in, it's very bluesy, very pentatonic. So it goes like this. You also notice there as well that we're using the thumb to play the note there. So he's going from E to A flat, G sharp. And you see it's not moving at all from there, which is one definition of a pentatonic box. Now the whole riff of there is the rhythm way all the way through.
I suppose it was a good introduction to the band because it, in a way, encapsulated all the good points about Queen, the best things that we remember about them, the vocal harmonies and Brian May's amazing attacking guitar playing. So right away it was a taster for for what was to come. And of course, people never dreamt that the band would expand in the way that it did. But it was a good record, although even though it wasn't a hit, it kind of flagged up to the record industry and the public. We're here.
One of the central features of the sound that Queen showcased on Keep Yourself Alive was Brian May's extraordinary guitar. May had built the guitar in 1963 with the help of his father, and it was this custom design that allowed him to find his unique sound.
It was built by Brian and his father. I think they finished it in 66, 67, something like that. And they were both, I mean, Brian's got a PhD in astrophysics, so he's not exactly the thickest man in the world, and nor with his father, apparently. But this is a Burns. It's a Brian May signature model, and it's as close as you can get without spending £5,000 on one built by an Australian guy called Greg Fryer, which you also can do if you want to. What makes it unique are these, which are the pickups. These are Burns trisonic pickups. They're exactly the same as the one that Brian has in his original. And that would be fine. Burns trisonic used by the Shadows, by you name it, any band in the 60s and even the 50s as well. On Brian's guitar and also on this one, they are operated by these switches here. These three are on and off switches. The other thing he's most used to is these, which is an AC30 Vox amplifier, very famous, Shadows, Beatles, The Who, Yardbirds, you name it, Jeff Beck, everybody used these. Brian continues to do so, and part of the way that he gets his sound is he has the thing on full blast. Now, it's only 30 watts, but it is the loudest thing you've ever heard of, so we won't do it very often in there. Now, the other trick to it is this, is that, which is a treble booster. This is a modern one. It's exactly the same as Brian uses, although his is red rather than blue, fact fans. It's built by an Australian guy called Greg Fryer, who has built a lot of copies of the original, as we said, and also maintains Brian's original #1 guitar, did so for the tour that they've just done. So the idea with this is that it boosts this, an AC30 amp, which is quite a clean thing, into full overdrive. And the best thing to do is I'll just show you, shall I? Okay. So, with just this pickup on, and the treble booster all the way off, turn the amp on, yep, all the way off, it sounds like this. No, it's not exactly the Brian May sound that we know. His main rhythm sound is these two together, which is that. So if you have that, again, the treble booster is almost all the way off. The sound you have is this. Now, part of it, having these two together, warms it up, as we can hear. Compare again the thin sound and the rhythm sound. So we're nearly getting there. We're not quite there yet. So there's two more things to say. For the main sound, this thing's on full, which we'll do in a second. The other thing is his pick, which normally it's a sixpence. An old English sixpence that you can't, as I've discovered, you really have trouble finding them. So this is an Australian 5-cent piece. The reason I'm using this is because it's the same dimensions as a sixpence. Now the main thing with this, Brian uses this to get as close a feeling to his hand to the string as possible. A lot of guitar players use very floppy plastic ones, so you can do that. Brian is the absolute opposite, and that also helps with the sound. It's a very, very emotional, intimate, as you can have with two bits of metal, contact between the strings. Now also it's serrated, and I'll show you that as well. But Brian May's main guitar sound is treble booster all the way up. These two pick up together, and both of them are in phase, so I'm not mucking about with any of these switches. And it sounds like this. Very full indeed.
You going to mug me?
Am I going to mug you?
Is that gorgeous or what, eh?
And I believe I can run a decent marathon.
Thank you very much.
Download Veely now.
Queen's self-titled debut album was released in July of 1973. The album made little impact with either critics or the record-buying public, Though following a successful winter tour in support of Mott the Hoople, a large section of the music press began to reappraise Queen as a band of promise. EMI and Trident felt Queen should make a prompt return to the studio, this time with a sizable budget, and as the band continued to perform Queen 1, they were also developing ideas for their follow-up album, Queen 2.
The first album has the basic elements of what became the Queen sound, but I think they amplified it and exaggerated it, and the bigger and more preposterous it became, the better it became in a way. And perhaps that first album takes itself a little bit too seriously. And the great thing about Queen is they actually came, and this was, to me, their redeeming feature, they actually came to have a quite profound sense of their own absurdity.
I think you have to take Queen 1 and Queen 2 almost as a package. Yes, they were recorded at different times. It's almost phase 1 of Queen's world domination plan. And whilst I would say Queen 2 shows perhaps a more comfortable, a more confident band, knowing exactly where they were in the studio, I don't think that necessarily Queen 1 lets them down whatsoever. I think Queen 1 has some wonderful moments. And I think you put the two together and you have the start of something very special. So I would say, yes, Queen 2, inevitably with a band going into their second album, shows more confidence, but Queen 1 is equally as good.
I think with the early albums, the first couple definitely show Queen in a light which they kind of moved away from later on. There are a lot more, if not kind of standard kind of rock-based tunes on there. It's definitely kind of the rock influence that's to the fore, and I think they're great. I mean, the great British buying public kind of took a little while to kind of warm up to them. You know, critics were never that enamoured of the first album particularly. I don't think it even went top 20 over here, so it wasn't an overnight success.
The band resolved to tackle the ambivalence with which Queen 1 had been received by refining a new and dynamic image. They developed Queen 2 in an atmosphere of frenzied creativity, in which Brian's overdriven guitars formed the basis of a more textured sound and fantastical image. Queen's big break came on the 21st of February 1974, when they received an unexpected invitation to perform 7 Seas of Rye on Top of the Pops. EMI rushed out a single within 2 days, and Queen broke into the top 10.
7 Seas of Rye concludes the first Queen album, Queen 1 if you want to call it that, and it was almost setting up the proper version of 7 Seas of Rye which occurred on the second album, Queen 2. The reason they did it was they had it basically planned out and thought, rather like the end of a James Bond movie when they say the end of such and such, but James Bond will be back with, it sets up something. So what they were doing was giving a certain snippet, a certain commercial as it were, for album number 2. The full version is on Queen 2, and was released as a single, became their first hit. Part of the reason it became their first hit was it also coincided with their first Top of the Pops appearance. Now, David Bowie dropped out. Top of the Pops called up Eric Hall, who was doing their PR at the time, plugging away, became known many years later as a sports agent, but at the time he was plugging Queen. Kept plugging Queen to Top of the Pops. Top of the Pops weren't interested. Bowie dropped out at the last minute, so Top of the Pops rang up Eric Hall and said, "You know this band you keep going on to us about Queen? Can they do Top of the Pops and do it virtually at the last minute?" And of course, yes was the answer. You don't turn something down like that. Although Freddie Mercury didn't want to do it. He just said, "I don't want to do Top of the Pops, that's rubbish." But the other 3 members of the band outvoted him and said, "No, we want to do it. It's really important." At the time, what Top of the Pops insisted on is you had to re-record the backing track to your song and then mime the vocals. So Queen went in rather rushed into Trident, did the backing track as a new recording, which was a musician's union requirement, but it turned out really badly. So what Eric Hall did, he gave Top of the Pops the original recording, and they never knew it. So in a way, Queen cheated to get onto Top of the Pops, but that exposure, 10 million people or whatever, rocketed the band. They had a big hit. Queen 2 was a successful album and really got the band started on the way to stardom.
The one that did it was 7 Seas of Rye. For one thing, it had a very, very picturesque title. And this is at a time when rock had picturesque titles. Dark Side of the Moon is one. How about Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes? So 7 Seas of Rye, oh, that's interesting. Yes, we have 7 Seas, but rye, what's that? So it draws you in, it makes you interested, and it starts to create a rock fantasy. That's very much a rock song. And up until this point, Queen are very much a rock band. There's no idea of what they're going to become. 7 Seas of Rye just scrapes into the top 10, but it puts them on the map.
Seven Seas of Rye is a wonderful track. It's got so many moments which are typical of Queen, including Brian May's trademark guitar sound. There are the vocal harmonies which certainly became part of Queen all through their career. So in a way it's a trademark Queen song, and it's very heavy as well. And at the time when Queen certainly started to build their audience through the heavy rock fraternity, it was perfect because it retained the heaviness. And whenever you hear it now with that chugging guitar and so forth, it still remains a classic of its kind and a classic of heavy rock.
Compared to later productions, there are certain weaknesses. As I say, the vocals tended to get a little bit drowned, a lot more guitar, bass and drums going on. So I think Freddie hadn't quite exerted his personality at that point. It was coming through, but he hadn't dominated the group in the way that he did later.
Queen 2 was released on the 8th of March 1974, and the band's first headline tour swiftly followed. The album achieved a chart position of number 5 and had gone silver by September 1974. But despite this growing commercial success, the music press remained unconvinced, maintaining that the band were yet to find a strong identity.
I think they did have pretensions to being an art band at that stage. I think they lost those fairly rapidly, and to me that's when they became a lot more appealing. I mean, some of those early lyrics on songs like 7 Seas of Rye are clearly trying too hard, and there is a sort of Dungeons and Dragons element to it all, a Tolkien-esque kind of thing, and they dumped that pretty quickly, quite honestly.
The album is Brian May's favourite, bizarrely, because it was the last truly heavy metal album, as it were. He's a guitar player and likes rocking out. It was a very disparate sort of album. They had a white side and a black side. The black side was all Brian May. I think Roger Taylor had a track on the white side, and the rest of it was Fred. And all of the black stuff, the black side was all riffing on the guitar, Ogre Battle and all this sort of thing. Absolutely fantastic stuff. In 1974, it was fine. Led Zeppelin was sort of not quite sure what was going on with them. Hendrix was dead, bless him. And the rest of it was all Yes and Genesis, which is very difficult stuff to get into unless you were of that mindset. So bombastic heavy metal with a slight twist, i.e. Freddy Mercury, as it happens. It was, again, in hindsight, it was an interesting album. At the time, I don't think anybody knew what to make of it.
Queen were never that heavily into a rock sound, no matter how much of a genius Brian was as a rock guitarist. And so they were never going to be as heavy as Sabbath or Purple, but they were never going to be as top 40 tuneful, or so it seemed, as the Beatles. So where does that leave them? Elton John and Rod Stewart had the international top 40 wrapped up. So it very definitely seemed, until sheer heart attack, that they were just going to be an interesting group.
In October 1974, Queen found the watershed. Killer Queen, the first single from the forthcoming album Sheer Heart Attack, reached number 2 in the UK Top 40 and finally drew enthusiasm from the press.
She keeps a Moet Chandon in a pretty cabinet. Let them eat cake, she says, just like Marie Antoinette. A building remedy
Killer Queen, right from the acoustic of the finger snapping at the very beginning, a very loud, dynamic acoustic of something which shouldn't be that loud, but sounds great. It's like, how did Holland Dozier Holland make the organ swell at the beginning of Stop in the Name of Love so loud? But they did. Or the hand claps at the beginning of Where Did Our Love Go? But they did. And thus the finger snapping in Killer Queen. And with Freddie's lyrics, the reference right away to Moe and Chandon in the first line, the reference to Khrushchev and Kennedy, who were only 10 years behind us at that time. This was an adult lyric. And it was a very British lyric, in the style of Noel Coward, but for the rock generation.
That single is the first one that brought the band to the masses, as it were. As you say, it got to #2 in the charts. And it proved that the great bands, not just Queen, are far more than just the sum of their parts. So it's a piano intro, very, very strong vocal line. And, you know, there's not much guitar on it. I mean, live, there was chick, chick, that's what it was. The only guitar on it, really, is little flashes sort of underpinning the whole melody. Apart from the solo, of course, which mirrors the melody, which is a very strong melody indeed. So he actually didn't use this amplifier. He used a little one that his bass player made called the Deaky amp, which you may or may not be aware of, to get that sort of sound. But on the main solo, he's using a Vox. On the triple-tracked harmony bit, he's using that, and is also using his way of using his finger like that. I don't know if we can show you that. It's sort of, what it does, if you play up the neck here, it's a very nice full sound, which is the complete opposite of using that. So what he would do, he'd have all 3 pickups on here, and it was like that. I can't play it well. That sort of thing, which is also at the very, very end of the Bohemian Rhapsody song rather than solo. But I think that song, if there's one song that you could look at that was the defining moment of their career at that time, it is Killer Queen.
In conversation, she spoke just like a baroness. Middleman from China went down to gauge she might have been again incidentally me that way. Perfume came naturally from Paris. Because she couldn't care less, fastidious and precise. She's a killer queen, gunpowder gelatine, dynamite with a laser beam, guaranteed to blow your mind.
Heart Attack as an album was the start of phase 2 for Queen, for me. They still had the very big, heavy sound, but they were starting to open up their horizons. They were starting to bring in elements of vaudeville, elements of Noel Coward, elements, if you wanted, the Bonzo Dog Band in a strange sort of way. They were starting to experiment with the way they perceived music, or rather, allowing the audience to see the way they perceived music. Killer Queen was the big single on the album, and if you listen to Killer Queen, which is a wonderful song, it's got so many of the hallmarks of what made Sheer Heart Attack a step forward. The vocal harmonies are there, but sometimes it's barbershop quartet. Sometimes what you're listening to is Hollywood musical in a strange way with that song. Still got the heaviness in there, but what they did with Killer Queen was say, right, in a way, what we're going to do is represent where we're going musically in so many different directions and put the whole potpourri into one track. And that track, Killer Queen.
Killer Queen is the song where they start bringing in these other elements. They created this hybrid of glam rock and heavy rock. I think with Killer Queen, that's where something else comes in. And it's almost a sort of Victorian music hall quality. I mean, you know, imagine if they had dry ice in the days of music hall, you might end up with something like Queen. And I think, it was round about then that Freddie said that he was more Liza Minnelli than Robert Plant.
Sheer Heart Attack was released on November the 8th, 1974, and peaked at number 2 in the album chart. Killer Queen, for which Freddie had received an Ivor Novello Award, had focused popular attention on the flamboyant frontman, and it was the growing influence of Mercury's personality that started to mark Queen out.
I think as an album, Sheer Heart Attack saw Queen opening up phase 2 of their career, which really came to fruition with Night at the Opera and Day at the Races. This was a band showing their roots, showing their heaviness, but also prepared to try different things. And the experimentation that came through on that album was fascinating.
Nobody else was doing music like that, to be fair to all the other bands of the 70s. They were all rather serious and po-faced. There was an awful lot of humour in Queen's work. Daring cheek, really. You can imagine them spending hours laughing in the studio while they were working out these intricate harmonies and doing things that nobody had done before. So I can imagine they had an awful lot of fun down at Trident Studios in Soho, London, where it all took place.
Sheer Heart Attack is a move towards the classic Queen image, which is, yes, this is still a rock group and a very good one, but it has this astonishing frontman who isn't a soloist. He's in the group and he's part of the group, but it gives the group something that no other rock group has, and this is what they needed to set themselves apart from Floyd and Zeppelin, Sabbath and Purple, or the Beatles, to have this extraordinary androgynous frontman with the incredible voice.
He's assembled a lifestyle that resembles few others. So far, there are no signs of Freddie Mercury succumbing to conservatism.
Freddie Mercury is pivotal to the success of Queen. Without him, they wouldn't have been a success. He really was the kind of the emotional engine, really, of the band. He was the heartbeat of the group. It was his anger, his sense of frustration, his love of life, and all the sort of aspects of his personality, larger-than-life personality, reflected in all these extraordinary songs that he wrote. Quite daring and imaginative songs, full of wit and humour. As a musician as well, a great pianist, a remarkable singer with a huge range. If you listen to him now, the fact that he could sing a ballad and then roar out an operatic aria, how many blues singers can do that? Not too many, I don't think.
I think without Freddie Mercury, Queen probably would today be regarded in the same way that we look back at, I don't know, King Crimson or somebody like that. I think if Brian May had been the dominant force in that group, as opposed to just one dominant force, they'd have stayed stuck in a kind of riff-oriented heavy rock. And it would have run its course fairly swiftly. And then when punk came along, that probably would have just about finished them off. So I think their success has to be, with all due respect to Brian May, who was a fine guitarist and is a fine musician, but without Freddie Mercury, I don't think we would remember Queen at all.
With the growing confidence that Mercury displayed on Sheer Heart Attack, a new songwriting dynamic developed between Freddie and Brian, a dynamic that lifted the band beyond the formal rock constraints of many of their contemporaries, without ignoring the basis of their sound.
If you're a songwriter and you use the guitar as your main songwriting tool, you're going to write in maybe 4 keys. So you're going to be A, E, D, G, and if you're particularly hard, in a B. Now the reason for that is that in those sort of keys there are lots of open strings that you can use. But with Fred, when he's composing, he'll often use non-guitar friendly keys. And it won't be a conscious, well, I assume it wouldn't have been a conscious thing, it'll be easy for him to play. And just as guitar players will want to write stuff that's easy for them to play on the guitar, ditto for him. Now A flat, which a lot of the songs were in, is a lot of the black notes on the piano keyboard, a lot of the black notes. And so A flat is there. You can hear how different that is from A. I mean, you might, you know, it's something you may not perceive, but you'll certainly go, oh, why does that sound different? So A is like... We've heard that a million times. A flat is this. This gives you an idea of why guitar players don't like playing an A flat. But what they had to do was, Brian was writing the solos, it obviously had to be in the same key, and that's one of the reasons why, you know, it'd catch your ear, as well as it being a very regal sound, which, you know, which a lot of people have referred to his guitar playing and his guitar sound as being. And whether that's coincidence in a band called Queen, I don't know. I think it is coincidence. But the regal side of it, the royal, majestic, triumphant side of it, as we've said, is a lot down to the X factor, these strange piano keys, and the fact that his guitar, especially with the orchestrations, he could make it sound like a medieval orchestra full of crumb horns and serpents and what have you, which is bizarre, to say the least, for a leery old rock band, which they were at the time.
The way that Queen actually rather toyed with people in a way, they had fun by blending all these elements in their music and just once in a while showing everybody that they really were a heavy, hard rock band and they could blow everybody else away. I mean, sometimes they played like Status Quo, another time they sounded a bit like Motorhead. And in the case of Stone Cold Crazy, which was on Sheer Heart Attack, this gave Brian May a chance to show all the other guitar players in the world just what he was made of. So if anybody felt uncomfortable ever about, say, Freddie Mercury's kind of high camp persona, then it was all thrown out the window and sort of set aside by Brian May's very macho guitar playing on that track.
Brian would, and still does, I'm sure, to this day, go off with his guitar and go, well, that sounds like a good riff. So Stone Cold Crazy is one of the heaviest things I've ever done. The other one is Dead on Time, which is on the Jazz album, which is in the same key, which is in F sharp. So on Keep Yourself Alive, you've got the serration of the pick doing the rhythm. And, excuse me, Stone Cold Crazy is vaguely the same sort of thing, although, as we said, it's in F sharp, which is... But that's a real wig out. The solo, you know, it's a rock song. It's a rock song in 4/4, dum 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 dum, and it's no coincidence that the Freddie Mercury tribute 100 years later, Metallica covered it and rocked out and made it even heavier still. It was interesting stuff.
The interesting thing about Stone Cold Crazy, I think people forgot about it for years, and the Metallica covered it. And a lot of people woke up and thought, wow, this is a great song. Went back and visited the original. Now, the original isn't quite as state-of-the-art as Metallica's version. Can't be. It was done a long time before. But it's a really heavy, driving, anthemic song that has a perfect motif for Freddie Mercury, because it's Freddie Mercury proving he was a great heavy rock singer. People think about Freddie Mercury today, the flamboyance, the attitude, the aplomb, the larger-than-life character, the guy with a voice that could do so many different things. But what sometimes people need reminding about is, hey, he could do heavy rock as well, and he could do heavy rock as well as anybody. And if you listen to James Hetfield's interpretation on Metallica's performance, and subsequently when Hetfield joined Queen for the Freddie Mercury tribute show at Wembley Stadium, he mimics Freddie Mercury's performance on it. Does it rather well, but it actually proves and shows how much of a great rock singer Freddie Mercury was.
Walking down the street, shooting people that I meet with my Robert Tommy water gun. You give me deputies, gonna come and get me. You gotta get them in the. Got the sirens loose. I ran right out of juice. They're gonna put me in a cell if you can't go to wherever they can do it. Stone cold crazy, you know.
1975 began in frustration for Queen. Their restrictive management contract was hampering efforts to shape new material, as the band became increasingly resentful towards Trident. Queen finally managed to negotiate an end to the Trident contract in August, and the band retained Elton John's manager, John Reid, to handle their affairs. Queen presented Reid with a new song, Bohemian Rhapsody, which they hoped to release as their next single. Reid contended that a 6-minute song would never gain radio play, but acquiesced to the collective will of the band, and on the 31st of October 1975, Bohemian Rhapsody was released.
It's basically a phase that we were going through at the time, and I think it's a lot of timing, a lot of luck, actually. And it was a night at the opera time, and we were just writing like crazy. I mean, there was so much hunger there. We just had so much that we wanted to bring out. It was all sort of kept in, and so we had all kinds of songs, and Bohemian Rhapsody happened to be, it was basically like 3 songs that I wanted to put out, and I just put the 3 together.
Right.
And then it had a very big risk factor, yes. The radios didn't really like it initially because it was too long, and the record company said, you know, you can't market it that way. And after me having virtually put the 3 songs together, they wanted me to sort of slice it up again.
It's Freddie Mercury's rock opera, if you want, but whereas Pete Townsend with The Who or Roger Waters of Pink Floyd took albums to bring their point home, Freddie Mercury did it in 6.5 minutes. Of course, the other thing was it was a hit single, one of the biggest hits of all time. And who'd have thought it? In 1975, you can just imagine the people at EMI sitting down with Queen, listening to what was a Night at the Opera album. They're saying, well, we hear 1 or 2 hit singles, and Queen saying, yeah, Bohemian Rhapsody, we want as the first single. And they're going, you're joking. Are you mad?
I think most people were quite stunned and amused, actually, by Bohemian Rhapsody. I remember it was said that the record company actually didn't want to release the single because it was too long, which is a complete nonsense. It just shows you what they were up against, and the fact that it wasn't always easy for Queen to get across their ideas. This was ultimately very daring indeed. I mean, there were long records before. MacArthur Park was a good example of a very long single track. And the Animals' House of the Rising Sun back in the 60s. That took alarm to record companies because they're afraid, are they going to play this on the radio? And of course, 20, 30 years down the line, every radio station in the world plays Bohemian Rhapsody probably once a day.
Mama just killed a man, put a gun against his head, pulled my trigger, now he's dead. Mama, life had just begun, but now I've gone and thrown it all away.
This is where Freddie's unique contribution really comes through. Yes, Stairway to Heaven had segments, but they were musically serious. They came from the English folk tradition. And what Freddie is bringing is Shirley Bassey and Liza Minnelli. This is a whole new thing. A theatricality which has not been seen in rock. We have had visual artists like Brian Ferry and David Bowie, but they're almost more art school. Freddie is real showbiz. Brian's guitar part is no less heavy for all of this, but it's part of something. And here the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And this is where Queen really do start to take flight.
Too late, my time has come, sends shivers down my spine, body's aching all the time. Goodbye, everybody, I've got to go, gotta leave you all behind and face the truth.
Although it was three specific elements, the first bit before the operatic section, the big operatic section, and then the heavy metal ending, all three were written by Fred. And it's interesting from a guitar point of view, because Brian's gone on record many times as saying this, that he didn't want to just go da-da-da-da-da-da. He wants to write his own sort of solo, unique solo. Instead of his main rhythm sound, as I said, being these two together, the Bohemian Rhapsody solo is these two together. So with chords, it's slightly fuller. Main rhythm sound, Bohemian Rhapsody setting. Now what that does, it brings out, it's a difficult thing to describe, it brings out part of the harmonics of the note. Each note is made up of things called harmonics, and either they're nice on the ear, or like this one, they're not especially. That's a lot more harmonics there than this one. So the Bohemian Rhapsody solo, he says, goes like this.
Bohemian Rhapsody was a breakthrough in many respects. The daring use of an operatic structure, the way that the guitar sings in response to Freddie Mercury's all-powerful vocals, and a narrative structure is unheard of, really, in a simple, if you think about most 3-minute pop songs, it's very much a simple love story, or what are most rock and roll songs about? Very, very simple story themes. With this, you have to listen to it. It's a work of art, basically.
And it's soft when it should be piano, and it's loud when it should be forte, and it's fortissimo when it should really be loud. And so you have the sense of a sonic journey, as well as this incredible exercise in fragmentation, which is another reason they never thought it could be a hit, because it wasn't a through song like Unchained Melody. You start here and you go and then you end. This was bit, 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 bit.
What was it about? I mean, who knows? I mean, there's one story that it's actually, the lyric is actually far more interesting than you might imagine, and that within there is Freddie grappling with his own sexuality, because at this time he's still living with his girlfriend, but he's got a boyfriend, and he's increasingly become interested in casual gay pickups. So all of this is going on in his mind, and there is one interpretation that says all of that is there in the lyric.
To this day, I don't think people quite know exactly what was in Freddie Mercury's mind when he started to put it together. There have been documentaries devoted to the song. They've had Oxford Dons trying to analyse each line of the lyrics and to see exactly what was going on. Freddie Mercury, I think, perfectly summed it up. It's just a song, enjoy it.
In December 1975, with Bohemian Rhapsody well into its 9-week reign at number 1, EMI released Queen's 4th studio album, A Night at the Opera. The album quickly reached number 1 in the UK and climbed to number 4 in the US chart, establishing Queen as a truly global band.
I think when you get to A Night at the Opera, they've kind of hit their stride. I do think there's probably a sense that maybe record buyers and music fans are maybe kind of allowing things to run away themselves a little bit. It's almost like anything that, you know, the band put out in the mid-70s that, you know, would sell. It was a number 1 album. I don't necessarily think it's as strong as a lot of the other stuff that was to kind of follow. But then when you've got, you know, one of the most ridiculous singles of all time on an album, it's going to kind of arouse enough interest that people are going to check it out, but possibly not the finest hour.
Because Queen always changed, they always moved on, they always tried different things, it's very difficult to point at one defining album and say that's the one. But to me, if you had to, it would be Night of the Opera. Why? Because it's the first complete album that they did. It's the first one where from beginning to end, there's a feel of a satisfaction that you've got an album here that stands out song for song and goes toe-to-toe with anybody. And I think in a way, the secret's given away in the title, A Night at the Opera. Here's an opera, here's a complete performance from beginning to end. Each song stands on its own, but you listen to the whole thing, and there's a sense of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts.
By 1976, Bohemian Rhapsody had sold over 1 million copies in the UK alone, earning Mercury his 2nd Ivor Novello, and becoming the biggest hit since 1957. Queen spent much of 1976 recording. You're My Best Friend, written by John Deacon, was released in June as the first standalone Queen single, rather than a track from an upcoming album. A short summer tour culminated in a free gig in Hyde Park, attended by over 150,000 people. Work on the next studio album resumed after the Hyde Park gig, and in November 1976, Somebody to Love was released, charting at number 2.
I was quite worried when Somebody to Love came out. I had been happy that You're My Best Friend had followed Bohemian Rhapsody because it was so different. It was going from this amazing segmented masterpiece to a heartfelt pop song. Keep the variety going. That was always the secret of the Beatles and Elton. Every single's different. Somebody to Love comes out, and it is very obviously son of Bohemian Rhapsody. And although if Bohemian Rhapsody had never appeared, Somebody to Love would have seemed like a breakthrough. It wasn't a breakthrough. And you always worry for a group because they've got to somehow keep the momentum going.
Each morning I get out my diary, can barely stand on my feet. Take a look at yourself in the mirror and cry. Lord, what you doing to me here? I spent all my years in believing you, but I just can't get no relief. Lord, somebody, ooh, somebody, can anybody find me somebody to love?
It's not unlike Bohemian Rhapsody for a start, but it's both start off with the big vocals, but the difference is, of course, as we said, is there's a much more of a gospel feel. Much more of a black feel, that's Freddie's phrase, I hasten to add, not mine. That sort of vocal. So instead of Bohemian Rhapsody's mathematically correct harmonies, on Somebody to Love, well, it starts with a big glissando for a start. It's a lot more organic, should we say, for want of a better phrase. Starts with a big old piano, but it's like the first section of Bohemian Rhapsody, but in a song that goes from A to B to C.
But everybody wants to put me down. They say I'm gonna raise
Somebody to Love was Queen almost going back into the 1950s and going towards the doo-wop bands, towards the all-male vocal bands, the a cappella bands, you want the barbershop quartet-inspired groups, and doing exactly that. What drives that song is a consistency of vocal harmony, and it's wonderful to listen to. And while it is a ballad, and while it isn't certainly something to match what they did with Bohemian Rhapsody, which was a one-off anyway particularly, it's still got such a great melody and holds together remarkably well. Again, as soon as you hear the title Somebody to Love, you know the song, instantly know the song. And it's remained over all these years one of the most popular Queen songs as well. And I think part of the reason is that the sensibility of melody is never overwhelmed. They allow the melody to come through. And they allow the melody to come through the vocal harmonies mostly, which is a brilliant move from a guitar-oriented band.
Following up the success of Somebody to Love, A Day at the Races was released in December 1976, and by January 77 had reached #1 in the UK chart. Despite the album's commercial success, critics were less than generous.
Day at the Races is an album I personally think didn't quite match Night at the Opera, but it's not far off. It's still a very good record, and it's got some very strong moments of it that you rather enjoy listening to now. And Tie Your Mother Down, for instance, is one of the great hard rocking driving songs, not only of Queen's career, of anybody's career. What a great song. And I think the problem that Queen had was, having made a complete album with Night at the Opera, they tried it again, tried different things, and maybe didn't quite hold together as well. However, it's still a very strong record.
When you make an album like A Night at the Opera, it's very hard to follow it. You know, you can take all of these sort of great landmark albums in rock history, and the follow-up tends to get dismissed at the time. Later on, people go back to it and discover its worth. I mean, you know, that was true of the Beatles and the Stones and everybody, really. So it was a very difficult act to follow.
In March 1977, Queen released Tie Your Mother Down as the second single from Day at the Races. It made a muted impact, peaking at number 31 in the UK. The band soon put out a follow-up EP, the literally titled Queen's First EP, with an A-side of good old-fashioned Loverboy.
I can dim the lights and sing you songs full of sad things. We can do the tango just for two. I can serenade and gently play on your heartstrings. Be a Valentino just for you. That's because I'm a good old-fashioned lover boy.
It's a sort of number that you could actually hear on a 1930s review. But it has got a great melody. It's a great song because it stays in your head. And I think that's a trick with a lot of Queen songs and a lot of songs by the great bands, is as soon as you hear the title, you know the song. And that's exactly what happened. It wasn't very heavy, but it certainly had a perfect melody and also pitched Queen into a market by proving they were more than a rock band.
Think of you always, I miss you. When I'm not with you, think of me always, I love you, love you. Hey boy, where'd you get from? Hey boy, where did you go? I learned my passion in the good old-fashioned school of Loverboy.
Good old-fashioned Loverboy from A Day at the Races is a good example of, I think, a kind of in-joke between Freddie and Brian. You hear lots of funny little wah-wah effects from Brian May as he sort of counterpoint to Freddie's almost end of the pier kind of ditty. It's like a silly seaside song in a way. It's, yeah, I think it's a kind of gay nightclub sort of anthem. At the end of the evening, everybody wants to dance around and do something silly. So, and it's kind of cheeky lyrics as well. And it was a sort of piece that worked on 2 or 3 levels, I suppose, as an entertainment and as a cabaret item. Whether it's heavy rock or not, I wouldn't like to say.
Just hold on tight, that's because I'm a good old-fashioned lover boy.
As 1977 progressed, and with the new punk movement in full swing, the music press became increasingly hostile towards Queen. Their lavish lifestyles and decision to become tax exiles enraged some sections of the media, culminating in the famous headline that accompanied an NME interview with Freddie Mercury: "Is this man a prat?"
I think there is a case to be made that because they were so different from the albums bands that were around at the time, that Queen weren't as critically accepted as some of the other bands. You know, it wasn't as cool to be kind of releasing these pop songs in quick succession as it was to kind of disappear for a while and come out with these kind of huge, great 70s rock albums.
It's certainly true they weren't taken seriously. I don't think it was the campness, because David Bowie was taken seriously. I think Black Sabbath weren't taken very seriously at the time, and so the Black Sabbath riffs didn't help. But I think it was more about attitude. They were just too brash. And thinking back to my own attitude at the time, you know, as a young man in my early 20s, I was listening to Little Feat and Ry Cooder and all this rootsy, authentic kind of thing. You know, authentic was what you were looking for. And whatever the many merits that Queen had, authenticity was certainly not one of them. And it was that sort of lack of a sort of gritty, rootsy authenticity that really made the music press hate them, I think.
One reason why Queen were never taken seriously by the press in the pop world was that they were not leaders of a social movement. They didn't stand for anything except themselves. And in that sense, which is normal in a person's employment, they may have even seemed a bit egocentric. And of course, the fact that they had massive successes every once in a while made it appear that they were interested in their own success. At a time when things in the Western world were pretty bleak, we have to remember the 70s, the decade of Watergate, Vietnam, the oil shock, the 3-day week in Britain, rough times, and here are these guys having a good time. Well, that's great because it allows people to have a good time, but it doesn't say anything about the era in which you're in, according to the pop press, who are beginning to turn towards the new wave of artists who would come to be known as punks. And Queen, during the punk period, really stood out like a sore thumb.
It was a tough phase for us, actually. At one point, I actually thought it was going to be it. But I think Queen have this sort of, if there's a challenge, you know, we embark on it, and that's what keeps us going. I'll never forget, we were in the studios doing one of the albums. I think Sheer Heart Attack was the track, so it wasn't on the Sheer Heart Attack album. But the Sex Pistols happened to be in the next studio. And can you imagine, it was just like, you know, the whole thing about punk rock and anti-establishment all coming under one roof. And I got Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious in and to listen to one of our tracks. And I said, I'll sing on one of yours if you sing on one of mine. And you should have seen it. Oh, we can't be singing with Freddie Mercury and all that. Right. I was wearing ballet pumps at the time and things like that. But it was great. It was just, I called Sid Vicious, and I called him Simon Ferocious or something, and he didn't like it at all. I said, what are you going to do about it? No. And he had all these very well, sort of, he was very well marked, you know. So I said, did you really, you know, make sure you scratch yourself in the mirror properly today, and tomorrow you're going to get something else. He hated the fact that I could even speak like that.
In October 1977, Queen managed to sidestep both the punk movement and their critics with yet another international hit. The release of a double A-side single, We Are the Champions and We Will Rock You, put the band at number 2 in the UK chart and pitched them to the forefront of popular culture.
Well, if anybody ever doubted that Queen were kind of dominant figures in the 70s, they disproved all doubts. They set aside any fears about whether Queen would become the major band of the era with two blockbuster hit records, We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions, which were a double, unique really in the fact that it was a double A-side. Both tracks were put back to back and were #1 in America, which was a big breakthrough for the band, and became certainly anthemic themes that people, sports clubs, baseball teams, football teams, all over the world took as their kind of regular anthem.
The impact of those two songs together is so great. All rock and roll is there. You have the hard rock, you have the show business, you have the anthemic quality, the mass appeal. And I knew they were in for a long ride on that one. And boy, it was even bigger than I had thought, because it was a huge hit single as a two-sided hit. But of course, both of those songs have become sporting anthems in stadia around the world. Well, this was the kind of major achievement which was akin to Bohemian Rhapsody. And this made me feel good again for them. They were at the head of the class.
We Are the Champions, We Will Rock You are very straightforward, very easy and very simple and very anthemic. And any artist who wants to get up and get the crowd going, simple, do one of those two, because you're going to have the crowd in your side straight away.
That kind of tribally simple stomping drum beat intro, and then lyrics that are kind of pretty throwaway. I don't know, it's so simple, it's stupidly perfect.
And this is a good example of how Brian used to use feedback. Now, live they use it all the time, and feedback depends on the actual volume of the amp for a start and how it reacts with your guitar. So feedback is an effect, and there's a proper electronic definition of it, which we won't bore everybody with now, but in fact it's a circle. So the string is going from here to the amp, and the pickup is picking up what the amp is doing. So there's a circular thing, that's why it's called feedback. So if we just flick the amp on, and that noise there is mains hum, that's because the damn thing's so loud. But the normal track's in E, and as it goes up before the solo, it feeds back on E like this. So we turn the guitar up slowly, it'll feed back. See the note changes? Like that, so just turn the amp off. So that's a good demonstration of, even though it's probably the simplest track they've ever done as far as adornments go, is that clear, and the guitar goes like that. But like that. Just like that.
If you talk to anyone who's got a vague idea of Queen and no more, there are two songs they're going to know instantly. We Are the Champions, We Will Rock You, released as a double A side. Who knew that it would become such social anthems across all the boundaries? We Are the Champions is the sports anthem of all time. Now, Freddie Mercury initially said he wrote it as his tribute to Frank Sinatra's My Way, and then he admitted a little later, well, I had football chants in mind when I wrote it, and I had that sort of idea, and I could see fans chanting that. But I don't think even he realised it would be picked up and become such a great sports anthem played across all sports. All the biggest sports venues and events in the world play We Are the Champions, because it has that feeling of being on top.
I paid my dues, time after time. I've done my sentence, but committed no crime. And bad mistakes, I've made a few. I've had my shadows and into my past, but I've got through. We are the champions, my friends, and we'll keep on fighting till the end. We are the champions, we are the champions. No time for losers, 'cause we are the champions of the world.
I remember people finding We Are the Champions almost comic, actually, in some respects, because it was so in your face. And but they did produce an amazing sound, if you think about it. And the fact that it was a confessional in a way as well. Freddie was sort of pointing out, it's rather like Frank Sinatra's My Way. He's confessing that he's committed sins and crimes, but he's going to fight through and win in the end. Perfect for any sports team, any competition, really. So, yeah, he tapped a raw nerve with that piece, I think. Maybe it's all a bit overwrought and over the top. But why not if you're playing to Wembley Stadium and hundreds of thousands of people are cheering, waving their fists in the air and joining in the kind of celebration. And at the same time, you know, it was a sort of, it was a worldwide hit, of course, but it was also a kind of realisation that Queen were one with their audience. This is the point where every band loves to be identifying with their fans, and with We Are the Champions, they drew in fans from all over the world, you know, Far East, America, the whole of Europe. Everybody was identifying with Queen at that point, and that's why it's remained such a powerful piece.
There's been no bed of roses, no pleasure cruise. Consider it a challenge before the human race ain't gonna lose. I keep on. We are the champions, my friend. We'll keep on fighting till the end.
We Are the Champions has become almost a sort of alternative national anthem. You know, if you see 50,000 people in a football stadium, they probably sing that with more fervour than they do sing God Save the Queen. That did mark their transition to a stadium band in every sense of the word. And, you know, even if you don't like them, there's something quite thrilling when you do hear 50,000 voices singing that song in a stadium and everybody knows the words. And yes, I suppose that was the song that enabled them to take off in America as well. I mean, it is interesting, that double A-side came out in 1977, and we look back at rock and roll history, and what do we think of when we talk about 1977? We think of the year of punk. And punk had absolutely no impact on Queen whatsoever, either musically or, just as interestingly, in terms of their popularity. And because they had never really been hip, they couldn't become unhip. And this enabled them to ride out punk and to put out a record like We Are the Champions and We Will Rock You and rule the world, really.
The huge success of We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions, alongside the iconic status now afforded to many of their previous hits, suggested it was with singles and not albums that Queen reached their audience.
Arguably, Queen were one of the last great singles bands, which was interesting because they came up in that era when the album had become the thing. And perhaps they restored the primacy of the single, which may, of course, be another reason they were able to ride out punk in the way that they did, because punk was also about a return to the 3-minute single, not necessarily the 6-minute single with operatic choruses and 3 movements. But anyway, it was about the single rather than the album, and Queen clearly started as an album band. Brian May conceived them as an album band, but as they got bigger and bigger, I think they probably do go down as one of the last great single bands of our times.
Queen's 6th studio album, News of the World, was released in October 1978. Despite worldwide sales of 7 million copies, critical reaction was largely negative.
News of the World wasn't as great musically as some of its predecessors, but it was redeemed by the first 2 tracks, We Will Rock You, We're the Champions, with which anybody would be happy, and by the great Kelly Freas cover, which was a recreation of one of his science fiction magazine covers, but with the members of Queen instead of hapless members of the populace. And incidentally, it's a very brave group that's willing to show itself dead on its album cover. So, bearing in mind that they were turning these albums out 1 a year, for 1 year's contribution, okay, I'm happy. I know something else is around the corner, so there isn't a 3rd great track. All right, I can live with that.
I think when Queen got to News of the World, in a way, they'd lost their ability to make great, consistent albums. And I don't really think they ever got it back. They were a band who had great songs, but not great albums anymore. And I think the problem with News of the World is that you listen to it now, and it's got some great songs on it. But as an album, as a consistent record, does it stand up? I wouldn't say it does. Not that it's a bad record, but we're talking about the very highest standards here, and I don't quite think Queen reached those consistent standards again on a complete album, albeit there were great tracks on every one of their records.
Queen followed the release of News of the World with a winter tour of the US. Armed with their new crowd-pleasing material, the band played massive arenas, launching the era of stadium rock.
Queen were born to be a stadium band. I always felt from day one, the first time I saw them, at Imperial College, in a hall just before the first album came out. They looked like a stadium band. They acted like a stadium band. They were stadium rock. And what stadium rock is all about is projecting character, performance, getting involvement from the audience. And when you listen to something like We Will Rock You, it's perfect because it does have the opportunity for fans to wave their hands in the air, clap along. Queen knew how to write stadium anthems and knew how to write a lot of other things, but they were wonderful and brilliant at doing those sort of songs that you could perform on a stage in front of 70, 80,000 people, and the people at the back knew what was going on and would join in, and the atmosphere would take over. And that's part of the trick of stadium rock, that a lot of bands who get to perform in front of those big crowds never understood and don't understand. There's an art to playing stadium rock, and it's not performing in a club. It's about making a stadium into a club, and that's a very different thing. And when you've got the songs like We Were Rocky and We Are the Champions, they help enormously.
I think one thing that Queen did kind of bring to the game that nobody else did was the kind of arena rock experience that we kind of know and love now. Because they were writing these kind of nuggets of great, easily accessible pop music, I think maybe the balance shifts, so it's about kind of going to see the band and them being the kind of driving force behind the evening. You don't need kind of a great deal of other stimulation to kind of go and watch Freddie in skin-tight lycra jumping around and Brian, you know, throwing out these kind of wild melodic guitar solos. And I think without them, I think the kind of arena rock experience that would kind of, you know, was the 80s would probably have been different. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I suppose, depends on your point of view.
Live, they were fantastic. Yeah, there was both at the NEC in Birmingham, and I saw them, and it was the loudest thing in the world. It was just great. And a lot of bands, especially these days, and it's more on the pop side of it, aren't designed to play live. They're not live animals. It's a studio thing. But in older bands like Queen, live was the thing, and then, maybe we better do an album then. That's what it was. And Queen are by no means unique in this scenario, but they'd tour, record, and it was like that and like that and like that until 1980, The Game, apparently, where they thought, right, that's it. And nothing came out until Hot Space in 1982. So maybe they should have carried on playing live.
1978 saw the release of another double A-side single, Fat Bottom Girls and Bicycle Race, 2 tracks taken from the forthcoming album Jazz.
They had a double A-side of Fat Bottom Girls and Bicycle Race. Not good for the credibility, first of all. But secondly, neither of those was a great record. I mean, they got a big sound on Fat Bottom Girls, particularly, but it just wasn't a great record. And this would happen. They would alternate the great with the not so great. In retrospect, that's no problem because you just listen to the great. But at the time, it was hard to tie them down, let alone their mother. And where do you put them? In the greats or the fading greats?
Bicycle Race is actually a very clever, witty piece of writing, especially with the interesting use of the way that Freddie starts to sing and then is immediately interrupted by the rest of the guy's vocal harmonies. So it's like a false start, constant interruptions throughout. But once he gets the message across, which is the freedom of being able to ride his bike and doesn't care about anything else in the world, just not interested in Superman or Star Wars, all these sort of dippy, dotty lyrics crop up, which is very funny, very amusing, and quite an original piece. I actually think it's one of my favourite Queen tracks for some bizarre reason.
Like all the great Queen songs, melody is the essence, and whatever else they put in, whatever style they adopted, the fact is that Queen always understood and appreciated and respected the melody of the song, and they knew how to consistently repeat a refrain in the way that the Beatles did a generation earlier to get it into people's consciences, because that's the essence of a single. Get it into the conscious, make sure people understand it, make sure people hit it, make sure people hear it. And that's what they did with Fat Bottom Girls, and more importantly with Bicycle Race. Again, there's songs that as soon as you hear the title, you know what they sound like.
Jazz is rather an interesting album, really. It's a bit scrappy, a bit bitty, and not much to do with jazz, really, although there are elements of that in Brian May's playing at times when he fancies swinging or playing a bit of rockabilly. But the actual album itself was quite democratic as well. It gave the others a chance to chip in with songs, although you notice that, generally speaking, when it's not a Freddie Mercury song, it doesn't sound like a Queen song. It kind of veers off at a tangent, and I think we got that with Brian May's rather inelegantly titled Fat Bottom Girls, which was probably one of their most controversial pieces. I don't know quite why they did it still, really, with the accompanying vulgar video, and offended a lot of feminists at the time.
Yes, I mean, I think they embraced this humour more and more openly as their career went on. I think Freddie in particular came to regard it all as one huge cosmic joke, and on songs like Fat Bottom Girls, he's playing it for laughs, and he's also clearly enjoying taking a pop at all of that sort of 70s political correctness and so on. The bigger they got, the more they came to take the piss, quite honestly.
Jazz reached number 2 in the UK chart, and the band followed up the album's success with a European tour in January of '79. Whilst on tour, they released their second single from Jazz, Don't Stop Me Now.
Another interesting aspect of jazz is this diversity, although, of course, Queen were famed for their diversity, but jazz in particular seemed to have leapt about all over the place. You didn't know quite where it was coming from. A good example is Don't Stop Me Now, which is an incredibly fast, powerful piece of rock and roll, really, with Brian May flying free. Where does that come from? Where is it all heading for? It sounds a bit of a train wreck as a piece, actually, but it's a good example of the slight, the point where diversity becomes confusion, I suppose. If you wanted to say, this was the only album you ever heard by Queen, it would have left you somewhat confused, I would have thought.
Although Don't Stop Me Now was a number 9 hit in the UK, it made little impact across the Atlantic, peaking at number 86 in the US chart. The diversity found across the jazz album often polarised critics and audiences alike.
They weren't heavy rock, they weren't kind of blues-based rock. So what were they? And they weren't even a pop band per se, because they were doing different things, kind of exploring different avenues. And that kind of jumping around makes things difficult for people to pigeonhole. And I think it's easier kind of looking back to see, how much they did and achieved and changed the course of things. But at the time, it was probably just a bit confusing.
I think the trick with Queen was they go into a genre that interested them and do one song, maybe 2 at most. They never delved into it in an entire album. Well, they did a little later on with Hot Space when they really went into that whole funk area, and for me it failed a lot. Other people love it, I don't. But the essence of what made Queen successful was they wrote great songs and would adapt them to a style. But they did it understanding what made that style work. If they did disco, they did it well. If they did rockabilly, they did it well. If they did vaudeville, they did it well. Everything they did very well indeed. Because they never tried something or never put out something they didn't believe they'd pulled off.
In late 1979, Queen released Crazy Little Thing Called Love, taken from their 8th studio album, The Game. The single was a massive hit, reaching number 2 in the UK and giving Queen their first ever US number 1.
Well, if people thought they knew all there was to know about Queen, they were in for a shock when The Game came out, which was just on the cusp of the 80s dawning, the new decade, and a new era for Queen, I guess, because it did produce 2 of their biggest, best hits people still love. still want to play and listen to, which was Crazy Little Thing Called Love, which was one of my favourite Queen records, mainly because I suppose it harked back to the early days of rock and roll, but did it in a way that was so much superior to so many kind of covers bands.
It's a shame because the album that it came from, The Game, was just slagged just because the critics didn't like this idea of them sort of going back to Elvis, where the whole of modern music starts anyway. It was very tongue-in-cheek, of course, all leather and hands through the floor and all that sort of stuff. It was great. But there are only two instances of Brian not using his Red Special on any Queen track. One is Long Away, which is on Day at the Races, which was a Burns Steer 12-string. The other was on Crazy Little Thing Called Love, which is a black 1977 Fender Telecaster. It's the one in the video, it's the one he used it on stage, and he's still got that guitar to this day as far as I'm aware.
Take a long ride on my motorbike to the ready, crazy little thing I know. This thing, come on, I know, to handle this thing, shallow. I must be right to win, ready, crazy little thing I know, crazy little thing I know, take it.
He played it through a Mesa Boogie amp, a Mesa Boogie Mark I, which is as different as it gets as far as the electronics of an amplifier goes to this AC30. He always hated the sound, and obviously live on stage he did the acoustic whilst Fred was at the front with his guitar that doesn't know any chords, or whatever he used to say, this bloody thing. Fantastic. Brian would do the solo on the Telecaster and then rock out with the Red Special at the end. So I think live, he quite enjoyed sort of all the different sounds and what have you.
Crazy Little Thing Called Love was, in a way, Freddie Mercury's tribute to Elvis Presley. It's got that style. It's very much of that rock and roll era. It's a good track. It's not one of my favourite Queen songs, but again, it sticks in your mind, and it gave them an opportunity to be a bit more rock and roll and to almost rockabilly it, if you want to use that phrase, and come straight back down to being a four-piece again. It also really put them on the path where you could see that there was a lot of homoeroticism about the way Freddie Mercury moved, behaved, and reacted. That, strangely enough, didn't really put the American audience off. It was to be put off a little later by something else, which was So Carry On, but they didn't get the humour. At the time, the American audiences seemed to be okay with the fact that Freddie Mercury had this sort of image, maybe because the Village People had been around, I don't know, but there was a certain element of that. And they also did it with a certain sense of style and humour.
That went to become #1 in America, but even that was dwarfed by the tremendous success of Another One Bites the Dust, which sold over 2 million as a single in the United States alone and was on the chart forever. Of course, John had been very clever in picking up that chic bass line, but nonetheless, the group had built on top of it this marvelous sound, this marvelous song, and as is so often with popular music, if you use as a title a popular expression and you do it well, it's doubly memorable.
Let's go! She walks barely down the street with the brim pulled way down low. Ain't no sound but the sound of his feet. Machine guns ready to go. Are you ready? Hey, are you ready for this? Are you hanging on the edge of your seat? Out of the doorway, the bullets rip to the sound of the beat. Yeah. Another one bites the dust.
I think they were very natural kind of adopters of things that were going on at the time in some respects when you get to dealing with songs like Another One Bites the Dust. I mean, the first 3 bass notes of that are, lifted straight from Chic. But then it kind of goes and does something different. It doesn't become a pastiche of some kind of lame white funk rock thing. It's still Queen. Roger still plays, a fairly kind of straight, lumpy rock 2 and 4 underneath the bass line. He doesn't kind of funk it up too much. But they're obviously kind of aware of what else is kind of going on, but manage to do it in their own way. And there is that kind of constant reinvention, the kind of, sponge-like kind of soaking up of influences that are around and delivering them kind of in their own way.
Another One Bites the Dust is certainly one of their great records. You still hear it played. It still gets people up and dancing at weddings and parties. And it was written by the bass player, which perhaps accounts for why it's got such a fantastic bass riff. It kind of made a nod in the direction of disco that was sweeping at the time.
Another One Bites the Dust was a disco song. They put them straight into the disco dance floor. Again, it was a craze at the time. Queen thought, let's try something around that. They took a bass line from Chic, I think from a song called Good Times, built it up around that. It was a John Deacon song. But again, the essence of it was melody. And there was still something Queen about it.
Another One Bites the Dust became the biggest US hit of 1980. Queen were only the 3rd non-American band behind the Beatles and the Rolling Stones to have achieved this feat. The game was released in June 1980 and quickly climbed to #1 in the UK chart. By October, the game had been certified platinum in the US.
It was a perfect record, and you see, there you had, in one album, the essence of Queen, that they had 2 singles, both definitive in their own way, from different genre. The variety that helped make it. And if you add Roger's song Rocket, which is another type of song, there's accomplishment across the board. Fantastic performance.
By the end of 1980, Queen had sold over 25 million singles and 45 million albums worldwide. Over a 7-year period of unparalleled output and creative energy, the band had risen to become one of the biggest acts on the planet. That they routinely played to vast arenas said much for the scale and breadth of the sound that created both stadium rock and, in Freddie Mercury, one of the icons of contemporary music.
He was multi-talented, Freddie Mercury, this all-powerful personality. which sometimes worked against him. I mean, people did find him so over the top that they would flinch and reject him. A lot of people couldn't stand Queen for that very reason. You know, you have to understand that as much as people loved Queen, there were as many people who were hostile towards them or rejected them and didn't like them at all, or couldn't see what they were doing. But without him, I don't think Queen would have been a success, and he certainly towers above rock music. Now, especially more in retrospect, since his tragic death, and listening to all the music that they produced during that fever-pitch period, I think we realise that he was more than just a sort of mustachioed guy jumping up and down at Live Aid and shouting, "We are the champions."
It's interesting because I don't think Queen actually had a great deal of influence on the rest of the music scene. I think they're one of those bands, they did what they did and nobody else did it like them. And you know, I'm sure there are certainly Queen tribute bands around today, but it's very hard to look at 70s or 80s rock and find a school of bands that were made in the image of Queen. What they did was unique, and it was almost as if people accepted that it was unique, and therefore there was no point in even trying to copy it.
What they are now is massively bigger and more important than what they were when they were actually at their peak of performing. But history, which culls all the time, has gradually eliminated a lot of the more important artists to leave the ones that people actually liked and who still sound good. And Queen still sound good, and people still like them.
That was almost there. Try another one, okay? Boom. Da-da! Huh? Got it!
All the hours in the studio spent labouring over all these brilliant tracks, all these remarkable albums. I think that's Queen's legacy, really, and Freddie Mercury's legacy is that they elevated rock music into something else. They took it a stage further that nobody else had the imagination or the wit to do. So ultimately, I think Queen were probably one of the best bands, certainly of their era, and perhaps one of the best bands in rock and roll history.